episode of the Hip Hop Social Worker Podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Scott, and today I have a special guest all the way from Iowa. We connected on Twitter, and he's definitely, a person who's has a pretty big influence on Twitter. I see him, I get lost in those threads sometimes, so and so excuse
I
me if I'm not as present as I should be, but I definitely do get lost. There's a lot of information coming through. But are you Professor Cummings, Professor Stephen Cummings?
yeah, it gets convoluted. Yeah, I saw a professor. So Professor Cummings is the title. I can give you the background on that because usually when you say professor, there's a lot of implication about that. Specifically, it's clinical professor since
Okay.
I'm coming in from practice. So unlike colleagues I work with who have gone straight through the uh, academy where they work towards their PhD and they are doing their work there, and then they do their postdoc or move into a tenure track position, and they work towards that. I did not do that. My terminal degree is Master's of Social Work. I earned that in 2002 at the University of Iowa, and I didn't think about being a professor was not on my radar or a plan of mine necessarily. I went into hospital social work in 2002 after I graduated. I did two internships, or two. I did my foundation and advanced practicum in hospital social work, and that was my vision for practice. I was just going to do that for my career,
Yeah.
and did a lot of that. Did that for 10 years, and then the opportunity to become a clinical professor became just showed up, and I realized it was something I really wanted to do.
Okay. So all right. So you started in the hospitals, or did you let's how did you get to that decision to become a master's of social work?
Oh, it's a story. I'll just share the brief version of this, but I got my undergrad in elementary education. I wanted to work with people with special needs, and that was my original focus back in when I started my undergraduate program in 1989. And I didn't think about social work at all until like the mid part of the 90s. After I graduated with my undergrad degree, my wife Sherry and I went over to Japan. We taught English there for a few years. That was just a thing to do. We were still in our early 20s, and the exposure there was setting the stage for social work for me because I had this experience of being outside my everything to being in that place for a while. And I loved Japan. It was complicated some of the time. Came back here and worked with people with disabilities at an agency where I'm at right now. And my mentor and supervisor there, Becky, she just said, what you're doing is social work. And if you're interested in a graduate degree, which I had been suggesting that, she said, you really should think about Masters of Social Work because that fits everything that you are talking about right now with the work you're doing here at this agency. So that got me on that path. And then she also embedded the idea of hospital social work because of the multiple systems in action. There's the macro portion, there's the meso portion of the interior of the hospital system, and then there's the micro, which is you're working with individuals and families in a pretty significant moment of their lives, often with trauma. And all of that really appealed to me. So off to school I went, got the work towards the degree, and fortunately where I live, we also have a trauma one hospital here. And that's where I got my experience. And so for many years there, well, I should say all of this fits within the decade.
Yeah.
So the decade that I worked there, most of my time was either in emergency treatment or inpatient psychiatry or surgical intensive care. And so a lot of people coming in with life-changing trauma events. End of life is part of that conversation. I worked with families who lost loved ones while they were in the OR.
Oh.
And I would get a call, like, hey, Steve, we got some bad news. Family's waiting in the waiting room, and their loved one isn't going to make it. And we already know this. So we need you to come and help with all of this, which, as a social worker, that makes a lot of sense. So got in with that. I also helped out with the Iowa Organ Donor Program and served as sort of like on the side with that as part of my role in the hospital. So I would cover the pager for that. So if a case was identified as a potential need for organ donation, transplant, I was called in to work with families again, address the needs that they have, see what questions they have as we work towards potential decisions in that area. So that all kind of came together, but it started out with just one person saying to me, "This sounds like something you'd be interested in. Did you even think about that?" I had no concept for social work other than just the usual, bad messages we often get in media when I was in my undergraduate program. So fortunately, and this is why I always think about this, I just had great contact with people, with one person when it came down to it, who said, "This is what you're working towards, and I think this would be a good fit for you." And I took that to heart.
Okay. So, how did you deal with having to like deliver that bad news? I feel like thinking about getting into hospital social work, and I've thought about it sometimes. I actually still do work at a psychiatric hospital, but as far as having to deliver that awful news, and how did you deal with the burden of that?
Yeah, good question. And so ethically, first of all, I should put out there that we, and specifically myself, I was never asked to deliver the news.
Okay.
That was still the responsibility of the physician. Occasionally, a physician, maybe somebody who's new at it or just wanted extra support, would say, "Be here with me." But often we would orchestrate, I wouldn't convey the news directly, but I would be there in the presence of the family to support them however they needed to get that support at that moment and beyond. But we would certainly be there. So like I said, and I think there's an important distinction, because sometimes social workers, I do think, get asked to handle some of that stuff. We also get asked to handle, for lack of a better way to describe this, sometimes we would be asked to come clean up, quote unquote, which means that the communication was made, however that was made, to the families, and then they would be distraught, understandably so. And then we would get the call afterwards that said, "We've got a really difficult situation. Can you come help us now that we've conveyed this information?"
Mm-hmm.
In my mind, that's not an ideal way to do it, particularly when it's going to be a difficult conversation with family. So to be present with them, first of all, it's great to know them before these things happen, if you can.
Yeah.
So that you work with them, and then they trust you when you come to speak with them. There is, what was it? I can't remember the book, so forgive me. But there was this book that talked about the presence of a social worker before the social worker even opened their mouth. The person knew that it was bad news, and they were coming to convey it. And so I've always kept that in my mind. I think that was Joan Didion's book that came out a few years ago about her experience with loss. So that's always stuck with me as well. We should be there for more than just those moments, but sometimes that's not helped. There's nothing we can do about that, particularly when you work in the ER or if you work in a ICU situation.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I've always thought about that would be, that'd be tough.
Mm-hmm.
I think about, things I remember before I earlier in my social work education, I was thinking oh man, I could definitely be a hospice social worker. I could do that because I have but I thought I had the the kind of feelings of a person who can just kind of go and just deal with that stuff. But as I've gotten older, and I've had a daughter, and she kind of opened up in a different kind of emotional portal for me. I was I don't know if I can do hospice anymore. I don't know. It would just be tough. So yeah. So people who do hospital social work and things like that, yeah. I mean, I definitely have a lot of respect for that, because it's something that I don't think I can handle it.
Well, I think you make a good point about where we are in our life when these opportunities come up to do this kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned ER. At our particular hospital, for example, we didn't actually have social work presence there until not that long ago, and I was brought in to pilot it.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least I wasn't. I said, yeah, I'll be happy to pilot that. That's something I think we need down there. And then it was successful, and then I was offered the opportunity to cover the shifts that they had down there, which if you're a nurse at a hospital like that, they're usually 12 hours, and they're usually 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.
Yeah.
And even then, I was in my mid-30s. I'm I don't think I can do a 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift.
Yeah.
that is asking a bit. And I already covered I covered a couple pages. Like I said, I covered organ donor, and I also covered the sexual assault response team pager for the ER, which was pretty heady stuff in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we should be able to do that work. But I think the self-care piece has to be built in institutionally for us to do it the way I think we can do it right, which is to say, I can't cover, too many of these shifts all at once, or I can't cover something right after having covered something else. In a good situation, we have the support we need, but also the time away from it.
Yeah.
And the culture behind that, particularly the time that I was in the ICU, the culture was interesting because I feel like there were definitely those members of the medical team who didn't see the need for that type of self-care, or didn't see the need for that type of self-reflection.
Yeah.
Because it's not a part of the medical culture. And I haven't been in that environment for a number of years, so I can't say it's how it is right now, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me if it still was.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely some. There's definitely some dynamics that clash. Still, but
Yeah.
people are to get more aware. I want to say at least at the place I work at. So now you're an educator.
Yeah.
For social work, clinical social work. Is that what like the?
Yeah. Clinical social work. I think when you see that in an academic environment, it should reflect the person's background and experience, having some sort of parallel along with those. When you think of somebody who's a for lack of a better term, a research professor on the tenure track, or they're getting tenured. Like I said, they may not necessarily have as much exposure to practice, but that isn't to suggest they don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
And conversely, once I've been in this role for a number of years, I'm further and further away from my practice foothold. I try to keep a little bit of that going, just because I believe it's important for clinical faculty to have that. But the reason I got this position actually is because we at the School of Social Work here at University of Iowa wanted to expand our distance education model to include online education and hybrid education.
Mm-hmm.
And I had some experience working with that while I was at the hospital, because I chaired the education committee there, planned for education sessions so people could get their continuing ed. And because we had people who couldn't make it to those sessions during the day, they were asking, hey, can we record these on cassette tape or something and watch them later? Even 20 years ago, that didn't seem like the most practical way to do it. So I was able to build a model so they could stream it, get their CEUs that way. And that helped. And that's something where I realized, this is actually a whole area of focus for social workers to connect with people from a distance. And so in Iowa, it's a need for practice as well as education, because half our state is very rural on the western side. So we try to reach students out that direction who would otherwise have to kind of move to Iowa City, which is a big deal. If you've been in Iowa and you're living in a western, I don't want to move 4 hours away to go to school. How does that work? So we try to address that.
Okay. So so like, is it like an online curriculum, or is it just like is that an option, or is it like you are in the curriculum and what I'm trying to say? So like, is it a curriculum that requires you to come on the campus, but it has like special exceptions if you can't, or is it strictly online?
Yeah, good question, actually, because we throw these terms around so much that they have implicit meaning. So historically, as you know, most programs are on the ground. You want to go to a program, you go to the program. University of Iowa School of Social Work is no different. And then, half a century ago, this is where I take a lot of pride in this, because we knew that we needed social workers trained and educated throughout the state. We have an on-the-ground yet distance model. So Iowa City is on the east side of the state. We have a center in the middle of the state in our capital of Des Moines. And then we have 2 other part-time centers on both sides of the state. And just for reference, it takes about 4.5, 5 hours to drive across Iowa. If you're on Interstate 80, it takes about, that long to drive from one end to the other. So it's it takes me longer to drive through Iowa than it takes me to drive to Chicago sometimes.
Yeah.
So just as a frame of reference. So we have on the ground programs there, and we literally used to fly people to teach at these programs back when we had that option. Then technology caught up. The internet caught up a number of years ago. We started building hybrid models, but we didn't have a formal online program until just 2 years ago. So that program is almost entirely online. We use an existing curriculum, and it's all the same people that teach everything else in our program.
Yeah.
And then we just we have them all gather. We have all of our students gather in one of our centers for an institute every summer. so that they have that contact with each other.
Okay.
So that's how we do it. So it's essentially hybrid, but it's dominantly online.
Okay. What's your favorite part about being a professor?
What my favorite part is,
Yeah.
it's actually, this is something that, like I said earlier, I didn't actually think about it because I didn't think I had the means to become one.
Mm-hmm.
So it's great to be able to work with people at this level, like have interactions all over the country with people through Twitter. You talk about those Twitter threads that just take on a life of their own. And sometimes they're just talking about coffee or things like that. I don't know. But sometimes the discussions are about other things. And I find Twitter to be kind of a mixed bag in a lot of ways, because on the one hand, I enjoy the connections. On the other hand, it can be very difficult sometimes to get out there and really have a really good discussion. But it's a great place to at least connect with people, so that should you continue that discussion or partner, I've been able to partner with people, say from Chicago and from the East Coast, like Mathia Marquardt over at Columbia, for example, and Melissa Thompson over in Chicago. It's great to work with them, and I think those connections were made in part because of how we've been able to connect on Twitter. So does that have anything to do with being a professor? Well, it facilitates that for sure.
Yeah.
Because I'm really working with great people. Not to say that if I were a clinician just working locally, there are great people locally, don't get me wrong. But it's really exciting to see this aspect of the work that we're doing. And I think people who downplay social media are missing out on the professional networking that is very much available to them. And sometimes
facts.
Twitter is a total cesspool sometimes. It's not a place to have all the great conversations, but it's you got to harness it and make it meaningful. And that's where you find some. And you know what? The criticisms and the critiques and the calling out, all of that has a place.
Yeah.
And I've definitely learned some things with my engagements on Twitter. I know I will continue to do that. I will continue to make mistakes there as well. It's another tool.
Yeah, that's true. Another way to get information.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did you use social your practical social work skills in being an educator? Like where do those kind of transfer?
So it's a good point too, because it's a good question, because I enjoy the parts of my job that I really enjoy are when I'm teaching stuff that's straight out of the practice area. So I've had the opportunity to teach a course on healthcare, social work in healthcare settings. So there's a lot of just personal experience, professional experience I can bring in for case scenarios, and have discussions about that in the classroom, so that students are like, yeah, I get it. You are somebody who's done this work. You've got this background. So that's been very helpful.
Yeah.
And I actually was teaching as an adjunct since 2005. I wasn't formally hired until 2012, but I've been teaching I co-instructed a course on family violence for almost 10 years. And that came out of working with adults in the psychiatric unit, where we worked with a lot of dependent adult cases of abuse and neglect, which is really hard. And in Iowa, we have a hard time serving those folks. And I think it's the fact of the matter is that's true all over the country, because of limitations and resources. So we're trying to do the best we can. And so while all of that is challenging, it's actually helpful to come into a classroom and speak to those challenges and explain why social work is so important and why we have a role ethically in making sure that we're doing the best work we can. When we talk about intervening on very difficult cases involving people who may meet the criteria for dependent adult abuse and neglect, and those are very challenging cases. So I feel, yes, it's the fact that we live in a world where those things are happening is very difficult, but I feel at least like I have a responsibility to draw upon that knowledge and share it in the classroom. So that's rewarding in and of itself.
Okay. Sweet. Yeah. So I often think about this. How do professors feel like, you want social work students, but the price of education and the student loan crisis is crazy. Yep. But you want social work students.
Right.
So how do is there any kind of especially a professor, who you're probably a little older than I am, so when you were going to college, it probably wasn't I can't assume anything, but I have a pretty good feeling that when you were going to college, it was a whole lot cheaper than when I was than I just than I just completed my master's 2 years ago. So coming from like that kind of generation, and you teaching this new generation, it's going to be an uphill battle, with these student loans and all that stuff, and being social work. How do you kind of like maybe like stay grounded and not really like be jaded, when you're dealing with these students?
So a couple things about that. You're absolutely right on that too. And there are levels that I think professors should be engaging in. One is understand that students are struggling, that it's expensive to the degree that we never used to think of. Mm-hmm. Like I mean, I'll confess, I'm still paying off my grad students' loans, but they're nothing compared to what people are facing now.
Yeah,
they just aren't. It's interesting. We first of all see there are some resources out there. They're patchwork in nature. So whenever we see whenever we have a new opportunity for tuition support, whether it's through a grant or it's through anything all that we can offer our students, we try to make the students know as soon as possible. Let them know this is how you apply for it. This is money on the table. You should go for it. Mm-hmm. One thing I've noticed is that students are so busy that they don't always get that information, and we can't just say, well, if you missed it, you missed it. We really have, I think as professors, if we know that there is a resource out there that they can use, we should be pointing them in the direction, advising them during our advising sessions, let them know these are the things that you really should do to help mitigate this. At a macro level, a couple of things. I mean, something will, I think higher education is changing. I mean, if you look around right now, it's not a pretty picture. Mm-hmm. That's I think is the outcome of some of the things that we relied on all these years. In Iowa, it's no exception. Iowa has got we have a lot of small private colleges all over this rural state, and they're either struggling or they're not. We have a lot of them that are struggling. So that's a harbinger for how things are looking in the future. And the fact of the matter is that the students can't afford it, they're not going to be there. Mm-hmm. They're just not going to be able to come. So there's a reckoning there. Anyway, the macro focus should be what can we do to get more support from the top. We've got this whole thing about, we all talked about loan forgiveness for years and years, and that we've been aware of for a few years now. That's non-existent.
Yeah.
The loan forgiveness only at the federal level only seems to impact a fraction of 1%.
Yeah, they said 99% of people that apply don't get it.
That isn't just that's wrong. The whole model for this has to change if we're going to persevere, and so that we need to be able to provide more support for more people if we value this education that we're giving.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the real fact of the matter is something will change, and it won't necessarily change at the higher education level. It'll change at some other interpretation of practice. Like maybe we don't need licensed social workers at this level. Maybe we need somebody to do it at a different space, because what's the practicality of that? It becomes this sort of classed out thing where only the wealthy or the people with the access to the resources can get the social work degree. It's totally unethical to barely pronounce words today. It goes against social work ethics.
Yeah. I feel you. Yeah.
Yes. Do I have solutions? My solutions happen to be just that needs to change from the top down.
Yeah.
It just absolutely has to, so that students can afford it. I mean, I would like to say here that the model of the way that states used to provide support for the public colleges, like at the public universities, like the one I work at, it's a much different. That number continues to kind of slowly progress to zero.
Yeah,
and that's a meaningful thing. We have to be we can't assume that anything is going to happen. And in Iowa, in particular, 2026 is coming. That's often seen as the big cliff, where we see a major drop off in enrollment, and that isn't just at Iowa. That's all over the place. So that's what I think that's going to force some change. And as a social worker, I don't know. We could have a long discussion about what is the investment in higher education towards social work.
Yeah,
in the practice. I don't want to leave this podcast without saying I believe it's an important relationship. I think it's great and important that we have social workers trained and educated at this level so that they're going out there and practicing in an ethical place.
Yeah.
But how do we do that? I mean, just that model will change.
Yeah. Yeah. People always say, like, get a scholarship if you don't want student loans. But the problem with that is that everybody can't get a scholarship.
No, right. Absolutely.
So So basically, what you're telling me is that you got to be either super wealthy or super
Mm-hmm.
smart to get higher
Right.
education. And that to
Or,
me.
or
Oh, go ahead.
mhm. I was going to say super wealthy or super connected.
Yes.
If you look at what we keep hearing is that the top tier colleges like Yale, Harvard, they're not going to be affected by this, but they have a whole system that is just mind blowing. Basically, you could be the most qualified student and they still have to make a choice that wouldn't be you because of the way that their models are. I mean, that's a higher education model that, from the business perspective is great, but from the equity perspective, not so great.
Yeah.
Because I can't expect people to go there. And interestingly enough, when we talk to students here in Iowa and we try to get them ready for social work, we have students who would be great social workers, and they look at University of Iowa not as an expense, but rather as like, that's a Harvard to me.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can get into that.
Mm-hmm.
And then they discover they can, but by the time that they discover they have the intellect, they don't have the means.
Yeah.
And that's a huge disconnection. We can't thrive. We can't let that go. We have to work with that, since we have great people out there who can do this work, and we're missing out because they can't go through the system that provides them for it, the education for it.
That's unfortunate,
So I cut you off on that too, but I just wanted to grab that point because it's a huge issue with higher education in general.
Yeah, and the point I was just going to make was like, you're going to have a lack of equity if you're only making space for connected, wealthy, and super smart. You know what I'm saying? Like that's just not feasible. Like especially if you're going into social work or teaching or something like that, to where like you need a person who has like a diverse worldview. You know what I'm saying? And not saying those people at the top can't have that worldview, but if that's your only pool, then you're just cutting down qualifications or qualified people. So
right. I mean, and this is the thing about diversity, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The idea, well, we got to bring more people into the table and include them, but that's not going to fit with the existing model that we do this, like you just described. It's the super wealthy, the super smart, super connected. How does that fit with people who are smart but not connected, or smart but not wealthy, or could be, and by the way, too, there was a great tweet that came out. I remember just on Twitter just recently about like this disconnection between GPA in undergrad and success in higher education after the fact. And that's another benchmark that perhaps we need to look closer at, because maybe this person got something that was like 2.9. How do we give them resources? Because they can obviously demonstrate the skills as they live their life more. It's like we teach human behavior in the social environment. We teach human development. We know that people get better with understanding the world around them as they get older. And so how do we take advantage of that?
Yeah.
How do we support people? Not just take advantage. I guess that's not the right phrase, but how do we support people as they can make that connection? Like I made the connection to social work in my late 20s, and that felt like, wow, seems like you're kind of slow to figure this one out. People in their 30s or early 40s or whenever make that connection. Like I can give back. I can do this work, and I can do it really well.
Yeah, I made that connection in my I think I was like 22, and I was like, I think I can figure this out. So you mentioned macro, and for people that don't know, macro social work is a thing. And I'm not gonna lie, I really don't have a lot of faith in macro social work. I had a job that was macro social work for the school district, and having to fight all the politics and all the moving parts, man, it just at the end of the day, it just kicked my ass,
Right.
So, but you are someone who has a podcast called Macro Social Work. Am I correct? Right?
Yeah, it's a little confusing. Yeah, but macrosw.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you are a person who are very involved in. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's macro's your thing. So
yeah, I emphasize it. I should say that, interestingly enough, I didn't think of myself as macro focused until after I worked in the hospital environment for a while, and found myself being a little more engaged with. I walked in there thinking I'm going to work with people on an individual, group basis or family basis. But a lot of my work almost immediately became, how do we find these resources so that this person can go forth and get, say, the rehab they need?
Yeah.
Or how can the family come together and coalesce around this person's need? Or how can we let this person how can we meet this person's request so they can die the way they want to die?
Yeah.
And those aren't necessarily all personal choices. A lot of stuff has to come together for that. So I gravitated towards this perspective that we work across the center, we work across the points. So social workers are often engaged across the whole thing. It's just where do they accentuate their efforts?
Mm-hmm.
And I wound up leaving that area feeling like I was accentuating more macro stuff than anything else. So like, and we could look at that and go, well, that's more meso, macro, and that's a fair discussion to have. But I endorse and really want people to focus on macro. That's how I got invited to the macrosw #macrosw group. Because of that interest that I had and that way to connect with it. For me, it was all about like, we're in the era of healthcare access and how controversial that is, and how people have all sorts of understandings and misunderstandings about how healthcare even works. And I realized this is a macro issue. People have a very wide variety of understandings about how one accesses and gets healthcare. There's a lot of inequity. People sometimes think the inequity is inevitable, and you just got to go with it. You didn't do this at one point in your life, you don't deserve to survive. At another part of your life, it's amazing to me how people were like that.
Yeah.
Just really briefly, how I came to think about that is every time somebody came into the ICU and they were facing a major trauma, and I was talking to families, there wasn't a single family or a single patient who said, well, I didn't really prepare for this and I didn't set aside the money for it, so I'll just have to deal with the way life turns. This is just the way it is. If I don't make it through the week, I guess I don't, because that's the way I never had that conversation.
Yeah.
Never had it. People always said, what can we do now? There's got to, and it's fascinating to me, got to be something, right? There's got to be something we can do.
Yeah.
There's got to be a program we can hop on, or, I don't know what we're going to do for income because he was the only one or she was the only income provider. And I don't know what to do about that. Nobody ever just said, well, the fates will now dictate the next step. No, people wanted to have control.
Yeah.
Over the next step. And to me, that really spoke to what is our understanding about the world around us at that level.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I got into it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just kind of seeing that our system needs overhaul,
It's fascinating because people and we could speak to this from a perspective of race and how people looked at it. Like I would say that, I worked with a number of families who identify as white, and they're like, what do you mean? I've always had the things I've always had the things I needed. Why isn't the system working to my benefit at this point? And it wasn't that, I guess I should say that it wasn't so much, I guess what I'm saying is they just always assume the system is going to work for them.
Yeah.
And I was sitting before them saying, this system right now, these are your choices and none of them are really great. And that's where we're at. And it's no fault of yours.
Yeah.
And that was an eye opener for a lot of people.
Okay. So, how do you like fight the uphill battle of like changing the system? Like how do you prepare for how do you get your armor ready to go and, kind of, go into these boardrooms where people don't give two shits about,
Right.
your ethics or, what you got going on. It's like, hey, the bottom line is this: we need money or we need X, Y, Z, and what you're talking about, we can say that for later.
Yeah, that actually came up when I was in hospital social work. The idea of, the pressure over the course of my time there was more and more, let's get this patient out as soon as we possibly can. It was all about the system of opportunity days, because Medicare is such a big payer for hospitals. So the idea that for every person that comes in, there's a DRG diagnosis and they get paid, the hospital's reimbursed a certain amount, but they always get that same amount. So if a person was in for 10 days, they get the same as a person that was in for 1 day. So the hospitals, naturally figured out that the more 1 day or 2 days you get over the course of time, the better for your overall system as a whole. So I'd have to fight a lot of the time to say, look, it's really difficult. I know I have to tell you, there's no place I can put this person, and we have to make other choices first. And by the way, the family's not even there yet, and we have to work for them. So it was a combination of saying to the system at large, we need to do this for the family here at this other point, this micro point.
Yeah.
Because they're not ready for the conversation you want us to have yet, or they may want to try other things first.
Okay.
And those are the battles I felt like were the most difficult sometimes, just because, at administrators, like, my job is this, your job is that. We're not coming together on this one. And yeah, so that was the real struggle. Probably why I mean, to be perfectly blunt, probably why I'm not still there.
Yeah.
And I have confessed that if leaving there was probably partly due to the fact, yes, I had this opportunity to move into this new realm of education, but it also meant a new thing to do.
Yeah.
And at the very least, being able to look back, stay on top of what's going on in the system, working with students who are in placement. I did field instruction for most of my time there, so I had students in the field with me. And that was part of it, kind of getting them ready to wrap their minds around what it meant to be in this environment and working with families at this level.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, did I steal myself up? You bet. I mean, get to talk to families who didn't want to hear the news you had to give them, talk to administration about the news they didn't want to hear, like this person's not ready to go yet.
Yeah.
I can't move a patient out of here. There's no place for patient's going to go yet. They're still on this machine, or they're still doing this, or they're complicated, or hey, they don't have insurance. And that was another thing. We had a lot of administration who didn't exactly understand that healthcare insurance didn't pass along. Nobody outside the hospital is going to take the burden on that we have to take up.
Yeah.
A rehab center doesn't have to say yes to somebody.
Yeah.
On the grounds that, this person isn't a payer. We can't take them. That's another big broken piece of the system that we have as a whole in this country. That you can't get people connected even when they're ready to go because they just don't have the insurance to go there.
Yeah.
And you're doing your best you can to put it together. And that was a constant conversation. Had to have that conversation over and over and over again. And it was how do you have to protect yourself. You have to take those weekends off and completely turn away. I know the compartmentalization is not always the best practice, but sometimes it's what I had to do. It's like I can't think about this for 48 hours.
Yeah.
Someone else can pick it up.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, that's the best way because it is a fight trying to change people at the top, or not even change them, just kind of change how the system is working and trying to decrease, the some of the inefficiencies and stuff that we that happens and just human nature really. Because, but I feel like before we really we've always kind of knew that the system wasn't really the best, as far as outcome and are caring about outcome, but I feel like with just the Twitter and the social media and the news or just the kind of 24-hour news cycle, we're really seeing that thing, the way stuff has been set up was never with wellness in mind,
No.
Well, that's
the sick.
Yeah. At least that's
sickness in mind.
Yeah. At least that's what it seems like anyway. But so the hashtag social work Swtech.
Yeah,
that is a huge one. That is
yes, it is.
That's one that I there's the old dean of my school of social work. She's a big part of that. And I actually was in a full online program. My program was online, 3 years online. So what is that movement about? The hashtag Swtech.
Well, I think if you think of it as a movement, it's just the idea fundamentally that social workers can be and should be technology savvy and technology aware. As you know, the Code of Ethics, the LISW Code of Ethics, was just recently updated, and a lot of those updates center around understanding tech in practice. Whether you're doing one-on-one counseling or therapy, how do you keep your notes safe? How do you keep your client protected? How do you connect with your client if you're going to connect with them by means other than face-to-face in real life environments, things like that.
Okay.
All the way to futurism and where are we going in the world as a whole. So like Dr. Laura Nissen, who's over at I want to say Portland.
Yeah, that's the dean.
That's the dean you're talking about.
Yep.
She writes a lot about futurism. I've had the privilege of meeting her a couple of times, and very grateful because I really admire her work. And she talks about this. She's on Twitter a lot. And she does this thing that I love on Twitter, which is like, hey, I read this amazing article. Check this out. Or hey, I read this, or I wrote this. What do you think? And I really appreciate that. And so where are we going in the world? So what does it mean when we have people engaging in talk therapy or not talk therapy? I'm thinking about therapy on text. Like, oh, it's 2:30 on a Sunday and I got to talk to somebody.
Yeah.
And I'm going to text them out because we're learning that people who are younger don't always go for this face-to-face phone call thing, face-to-face in real life thing. They prefer other forms of communication. Where does social workers stand on that? And historically, social workers have said, no, we don't, that is not pure social work, quote unquote. But that's privileging a kind of practice based on nothing more than just one's own comfort, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think the data is out there to suggest that we need to be aware of how people are connecting for things like that. Dr. Nissen shares things like, think about intake being done by automation, like you're talking to a virtual reality human being to assess some of the key things about you as you get evaluated and then go from there.
Yeah.
She shared an article about that recently. I think we need to be very, very aware of that from a social work perspective. So when I think of hashtag social work tech or SW tech, that's a lot of it, is all of these things, because I don't think I know anybody right now who doesn't use some form of tech every day, whether it be their cell phone, doing what you and I are doing right now, or in some other form. It's the norm. It's very much the norm. So social work we can't pretend that we aren't a part of this environment that has this stuff in it.
Yeah, you got to use it if it's out there. Especially you make a good point with the younger kids. If you have younger kids, I know there would be times where I would call young people and try to set up appointments, and I would never get an answer. But I would text them, and 20 seconds later, they're like, "Oh yeah, we can do that." So
that is I have a niece who it's educated me on this, because I remember, I don't know, I mean, again, I'm a little older, and we actually had to take we actually had lessons in grade school about phone call etiquette. How do you pick up a phone? Like, hello, my name is blah blah blah. I'd like to speak to so and so. And all of us had it. And then I have people who are younger who, they call me and I'm like, hello, and they're like, hi.
Yeah.
And I don't know who this is, but I guess I'm supposed to know. But it's because the data's on my phone. It's like, oh, this is who's calling, so I should be looking at that. And it's a small nuance about the shift of things. And I don't know if it was her that said this later, but somebody else said, yeah, I hate making phone calls.
Yeah.
It's so stressful. I'm like, I kind of get that.
Yeah.
48, and I get what you're saying. I don't like it either.
Yeah, I was the same way. Like texting was like my escape. Like, oh man, I don't have to talk to you, if I don't want to. I was like, this is cool,
But isn't it interesting how people they kind of feel comfortable that they just. Do you find that people that you talk to might go different places just by texting it out? Like they just they can communicate a little more close to the whatever it is they're going through.
Yeah. I think so. Well, it depends. I'm kind of in a middle generation where like people I talk to still use phone frequently. You talk on the phone, and then there are some people that I communicate with who are younger, and they do they're just totally tech. So it really depends.
Yeah, and this is just basic communication choices, right? This is just how do we feel in that environment? And you think about I was just thinking about how hashtag social work tech, SW tech. If you look at Sean Erringer, he's on Twitter, stuck on social work, I think it's stuck on SW. I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah.
But he writes a lot about all this work in healthcare systems and how they work with technology. Melanie Sage, over at University of Buffalo, writing about or talking about how AI is being used in things like child protection and so forth.
Yeah.
I have to confess, I think I see what she shares, so I don't know if everything is rooted in her work. So I don't want to attribute that to her work, but I believe it's an area of interest for her. Sorry, Melanie, if you're listening, I apologize for not getting it quite right. I do point people toward you and the work that you're doing, though, as somebody who's a leader in this social work tech as well.
Okay, so you being a white male, how do you hold space for things like conversations like equity, inclusion, equality, privilege, all the challenges that as social workers we have to kind of fight and go through and hold space for others for?
So you're asking how do I hold the space to make room for those conversations, or
Yes.
how do I have those conversations?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And it's every day that I think, oh, I might be doing this right, there's always room, right?
Mhm.
There's always room for more. And I teach human behavior in the social environment. And early days of teaching that course, I would come in and like, okay, we're going to talk about feminism today. And I apologize, I don't feel right talking about my role. So, but then I realized maybe that's not what instructors are supposed to be doing. Maybe not. I'm not supposed to be up here professing the truth. I'm up here to facilitate the discussion, create the space for it, and make sure that people aren't in our classroom, that people are able to have those really, there's a difference, right? There's safe spaces, and then there are brave spaces. And this is a distinction that I think is really important, because if it was a safe space, we just don't make room for difficult conversations.
Yeah.
We just sort of wink, nudge, and move along. But a brave space is the environment where it's on the professor to create the space so that people can have that discussion, engage in those things, and learn without having to hold back, but at the same time being able to go there. And roughly in any given year, about 98% of my classroom is going to identify as a woman and not a man necessarily. But that's also, not counting the fact that I'm cisgender identifying male. And so I really have to be, first of all, highly self-aware of the biases that I'm bringing to the classroom. And I may think I've got it under control, but there's always a bias. It's always a trace of that, or beyond a trace of that. So I have to be very aware of how I'm thinking of the world around me and how I interpret that as I go into to have a discussion about social work in any environment.
Yeah.
So the best I can do is to say, like, I'll go back to that reference about having difficult conversations on Twitter. Not my favorite thing, but being called out happens, and being aware of what it means to go through that is important. And I think the natural tendency for me early was to get really defensive about that. What do you mean I don't know? You don't know me.
Yeah.
Well, that's not really the point, is it?
Yeah.
We're actually trying to get at something beyond what you think about you.
Yeah.
And so over the years, I've really worked on to make sure that natural tendency, because I do carry around that privilege of, like, no one's going to challenge me. I should just be seen as an authority because I'm in this role. And I know it's taken some work to let go of a lot of that and understand that this is you're just merely facilitating. You have to do a good job with that. You have to be able to allow people to be sure that they're being given that opportunity in their classrooms or in the field. Again, I want to make sure I'm answering your question, because it's for me, it's something I wrestle with all the time. Like, am I there? Am I? And I remember a faculty of color was working with me a few years ago, and she's like, "Yeah, I got to make sure these students are doing the work." And I know the phrase "doing the work." There's a whole podcast about doing the work, and I love the phrase. But I'm like, hold it. Am I doing it? I don't know. I have to let me go back and work on that. I presume I'm doing that, but there's a whole lot of stuff under that phrase of doing the work. So and I think that fundamentally here for this conversation, it's constantly self-educating, constantly making sure that I'm evaluating where I'm at in this world and what privileges I'm accentuating and what things I take for granted and how that's different. Way back at the beginning of our discussion, I talked about being in Japan. The reason that was the founding experience for me was because that was my first ever time being out of one environment where I'm the dominant everything to being the non-dominant everything. And I talk about that as being a lab. It's not as if I felt, there were tough days there, but it was a lab. I could leave it, and I did. After 3 years, I left that space. But it was worth it to have that experience and be away from all the things that I took for granted, at least for 3 years. And that's what sort of laid the groundwork for my social work career and study and education.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's it's a good answer. I just feel. I
appreciate that.
Well, it is a hard question to answer. I think the only way you can answer it is like say, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm open.
Absolutely.
I'm self-aware. Because that's one thing that I learned in grad school was how just being just being able-bodied, cisgendered, was a privilege, you know.
Yeah.
Because I am a black male, and that's a struggle right there in some aspects. But then even amongst my race, me being a male was like, you know, I'm already, you know, like I already have a hands up on things, you know, and then they being cisgendered and, you know, like not, you know, just you know, presenting masculine, you know, and identifying as a male, you know, being cisgender is just you have a lot of privilege in that, and you should be aware how you show up when you're in spaces that don't look like how you look, you know.
I agree. I should put a plug in real quick for the National Coalition Building Institute, which is something that our university has a chapter, and I think they're at it's ncbi.org.
Yeah.
And I went through that training, and then I went through the trainer so that I could work with their students coming in. And the whole idea is to break these things down a little bit so that people have a larger sense of who they are and the things that they take advantage of in their own space when they're with other people. And I learned a lot, and I continue to through that, the National Coalition Building Institute. And they speak about the very same things you just said. And I should say that none of this takes away from the fact that, look, I like being who I am. You know, I like being a man. I like being this place. But I also love the fact that I can make mistakes and the idea that I can learn from them rather than recoil from them, because I'm going to make them. You can talk to me in a year, and I can give you a list of all the things I did that I learned from. And rather than feel like, oh, well, that's terrible, I should say, no, it's a good thing, because it's bringing me closer to this sort of larger context of the world around me and all the people in it. So that's what I have to say about that, is that, that it is an ongoing process. It is very much an ongoing process.
Yeah, that's true. Definitely true. Yeah, because I thought I was like, you know, the most open-minded person until I did this one assignment in grad school, and I was like, damn, it was really like, it was really eye-opening, you know.
Yeah.
So how do you take care of yourself? You know, what kind of things you do for self-care?
Yeah, good. I talk about this. I actually presented on this, and yet I'm not always the best practitioner. I do like physically moving around. I used to run, actually, for at least a moment. But as I got older, my body was like, no, you shouldn't run as much.
Yeah.
And it's like, this is fun, but your foot's starting to hurt, and you got this other thing. So be careful out there. You're almost 50. And that's there are definitely people who are much older who are doing a great job. Exercise is great. I love actively listening to music. I think a lot of us listen to music in a very multitask environment because music is easy to access.
Yeah.
I remember once upon a time you had to make action. You had to like put a record on, put a tape on.
Yeah.
And that meant deliberate action of some type. And just listening to music and doing nothing else, or at least keeping your other actions kind of limited, that for me is a kind of self-care, because you get to move into that space and listen. I do that with music. I do that with audiobooks. I write brief audiobook reviews for AudioFile magazine, and that's, for me, it's a lot of fun, because it puts me in places that I wouldn't otherwise be, and I like being in my headspace a lot. So, as more of an introverted type.
Okay. Cool. Well, I appreciate you for connecting with me. You know, I still am going on this campaign. I'm trying to come to as many college campuses as I can, whoever wants me to show up. So, you know, but yeah.
I'll see what we can do. We'll bring you on in. I've already got your sticker all over our University of Iowa School of Social Work space. Was going to do this thing where I would shoot my video of myself slapping that sticker all over town here in Iowa City. We'll sort of do this, I forget what kind of campaign you call that, but it's sort of like a kind of a information campaign, not a whisper campaign, but the idea that people start to see this, like, what is that? And your address is on there. So we'll see what we can do.
Yes, sir. I appreciate it.
To connect you. I know that just by following the model of yours and others, macrosw.com, quick plug, that we do a very brief podcast. It captures the essence of our Twitter chats. And in the spring, I'll be doing a more expanded interview type, kind of like this. And so I may ask you if you'd like to be on that.
Yes, sir.
We're going to do it a lot. We're going to do it with a live audience.
Yeah.
We hope so. It'll be a different flavor, but sort of the same idea.
Yeah. If you want to send me the link, I'll put it in our episode. Our episode description.
Perfect. I can do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, appreciate it. And me learning about everything that you do. Trying to make our connection stronger.
Well, I appreciate that so much. It's been a privilege and really enjoyable to chat with you. As a fan of yours and following on Twitter, listening to your podcast, this was a little nervous today because it felt like a big deal. So I was like very gracious. I'm so grateful for this opportunity.
Oh man, no problem. I appreciate you for agreeing to it.
Sure, thanks.
All right, I'll let you in a minute.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.